Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. Easter's over, a week and a half now passed, and for many people, the thought is we'll move on to the next event in our lives, the next event in the church life, whatever that may be. Easter's now in the rearview mirror. But in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. After Jesus rose from the dead on Easter Sunday, we have at least 11 different instances of Jesus being meeting with other people, being recognized. Paul gives us a pretty comprehensive listing in 1 Corinthians 15. The only thing that he leaves out is the Emmaus Road event. So we've had 11 events taking place in the 40 days that Jesus was alive here on earth following his resurrection. On the 40th day, he meets with the disciples one last time in Jerusalem, ascends into heaven, and then 10 days later, we find the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. So we're now into week 2 of that 40 days. Matthew tells us in chapter 27 that when they buried Jesus, the chief priests were a bit concerned that the disciples would steal his body. So he goes running to Pilate with some concern, and Pilate says, okay, take the soldiers I'm going to give you, post them at the tomb, make it as secure as you know how. So he put the 2 soldiers there. The stone is already rolled in front of the tomb. He puts his seal on it to prove that it has been, if the stone's been moved, it's been broken. And everybody goes home. Well, of course, we know the next morning, or on Easter morning rather, the ladies get there, the tomb is open, the stone has been rolled away, the soldiers are laying on the ground as if dead. They go tell Pilate what's taken place, and he tells them, in fact, he orders them to spread the news that Jesus' disciples did in fact come and steal his body away, gave them a large sum of money to do that, and promised that if Pilate found out about it, that the chief priest would make it right with him. And that's the story that gets passed around. In fact, Matthew in chapter 28 tells us this. He says, so the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. And yet, throughout the known world, the story of the resurrection began to spread. The disciples were called several times those people who were turning the world upside down. And the resurrection was the core of their story. But what I want to focus on for just a few minutes this evening is this. Jesus was concerned enough for his followers and for their future faith to make sure that he appeared to them a number of times. We know the events of Easter. He appeared to the disciples. He appeared to the ladies. He appeared to the disciples. When he appeared to them, Thomas was not with them. And Thomas, of course, didn't believe. And Jesus appears sometime later in the next week or two, next couple of days actually, to Thomas so that he can have his faith restored. We know that he meets, John recounts that in the last chapter of the book of John, that he meets with the disciples on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, that's in John 21, and restores Peter to fellowship. Now here's the point I want to make. Jesus could have ascended straight to heaven on Easter Sunday. He chose, rather, to stay for 40 more days, to build the faith of his disciples, to be seen by many, many people, and therefore have the visual proof that he was alive. He didn't leave it to just their faith. Rather, he made sure that there was plenty of evidence left behind. As I mentioned, I believe last week, some of that evidence comes from people who never accepted Christ, but in their readings, Josephus specifically, we find a reference to the resurrection. And Josephus was a Jewish historian who never did accept Christ to our knowledge. About a generation and a half later, a writer by the name of Eusebius has in his possession letters and eyewitness accounts from those who did see Jesus, and he writes about them. Now realize we're probably 50, 60 years after the resurrection, thereabouts, when he did that. Here's the point I want to make today. If Jesus was concerned enough about those disciples who knew him and heard his teaching to reaffirm their faith. Imagine his concern for us today. He told the disciples at one point, you believe because you see me. How much more blessed will be those who don't see me physically and yet still believe? That's us. And if Jesus was concerned enough about those who had seen him and heard him and knew him and touched him and traveled with him, how much more must he be concerned about us who have to depend upon our faith? So what does he do? He gives us the Holy Spirit, who speaks to us, who ministers to us, who enables us, who empowers us. All of that begins at Pentecost Sunday, 10 days after Jesus rose to the Father, or ascended to the Father. He gives us everything that we need to sustain our faith. A significant part of the Western church, at least, is beginning to deny the resurrection. I've talked to pastors who told me they don't believe that either the virgin birth or the resurrection took place, that it's simply a story, a legend that was made up to support the early beginnings of Christianity. In fact, I had one pastor tell me, he says, I preach it on Easter Sunday because I have to, not because I believe it. And yet, as Christians beginning to live in a post-Christian world, our belief in the resurrection is going to be absolutely critical to our survival in the world around us and to our faith in Jesus himself. The Holy Spirit is our support. He is our proof of the resurrection. He is a seal of our salvation. May I suggest that you go back over, reread the crucifixion, the resurrection accounts, and what Jesus did in the following 40 days. Refresh your memory of what the Holy Spirit did in Acts chapter 2 on Pentecost Sunday. And remember that Jesus did all of that for our faith, our spiritual strength, and our empowerment. That's how very much he loves us. That love didn't end with the cross. That love didn't end with the empty tomb. It continued through the next 40 days for those men and women who knew him personally, and continues for us today in the person of the Holy Spirit. May his blessings be upon you this week, and his Spirit inhabit you in ways that you have never experienced before. And I look forward to seeing you next week back in the Pastor Study.